Hi students, welcome to the Lesson 4 lecture on the wealth and inequality of the Gilded Age. To start us off with, let's look at kind of what the Gilded Age looked like in terms of the economic growth and some of um, the economic growth leading up to the Gilded Age, actually. Because America started out behind other industrializing countries like Britain. Britain began its first industrial revolution in the 1770s. This first industrial revolution spread to the US 50 years later in the 1820s with the introduction of textile, that means fabric mills, and railroads to states in the northeastern US. These new technologies caught on quickly in America, and by the time of the Civil War, the US economy had caught up with Britain's economy. A second industrial revolution took off around the time of the Civil War in the northeastern states and was fueled by, among other things, tremendous advances in steel production, chemistry, and later on electricity. With the application of these new technologies, all sorts of goods could be made more cheaply and in greater numbers. And American economic power skyrocketed to first place in the world by the year 1900. And here's a chart of that showing by the year 1900 here, America was the largest economy in the world, coming from nothing in the 1700s, outpacing Britain, France, Russia, China, Germany. But the benefits of these advances were unevenly shared. Business owners reaped most of the rewards, while wage workers and farmers were left with what seemed like mere scraps. John D. Rockefeller, owner of the Standard Oil monopoly, became the world's first billionaire by 1916. Meanwhile, average wages in America hovered around $2.50 per day. At that rate, it would have taken a typical wage worker in America over 1,000,000 years to earn what Rockefeller amassed in a few decades. As the chart below shows, average daily wages in America rose from roughly $2.20 per day in 1870 to $2.43 by 1898. A 10% increase over 28 years, or what I think is pretty much a pathetic average compounded yearly increase of 0.36%. So less than 1%, less than even half of a percent per year increase in wages. Here's where the United States here. That said, prices of consumer goods tended to gradually decline during this time period as the methods of producing those goods became more efficient and less costly. So the real purchasing power available to wage workers rose a bit faster than the numbers on their paychecks climbed. Their real purchasing power climbed by perhaps as much as 1.3% per year on average, or about 40% over the course of the Gilded Age. Still not what I would consider a very inspiring advance in workers' standard of living. So, understandably, some Americans at the time, such as famous American author Mark Twain, criticized these decades after the Civil War as a Gilded Age, an era with a magnificent gold-plated exterior hiding a society full of problems, injustices, and political corruption underneath. More and more workers joined labor organizations during this time period, demanding that they be given a bigger piece of the pie. Meanwhile, business owners fought back with their own arguments for why the toleration of unequal wealth was necessary and beneficial for the advance of civilization. Here's a graph of that wealth inequality. The top 1% in the US went from owning about a little over 30% of the wealth to 45% by the end of the Gilded Age. And if you look at the top 10%, they went from 70% to 80% of the wealth under their ownership. I sound a bit like Bernie Sanders here. The top 1% of the money, because some people talk like we might be entering a new Gilded Age where inequality is increasing now. Bernie Sanders has devoted a lot of attention to that idea. Before we look at how various groups of Americans responded to this new wealth and inequality, let's consider how America was able to grow its economic output at a rate that matched or exceeded the rate in other industrializing countries at the time. So, reasons for America's economic growth during the Gilded Age. Reason 1, investments in the U.S. were profitable and were perceived as safe. It is difficult to say exactly how profitable investments were in the U.S. on average. Governments did not collect as many economic statistics back then. There was no income tax, and thus little need to assess individual or corporate earnings. However, there is a decent amount of data on the prices and earnings of publicly traded ownership shares of large companies from the time period. And these share prices and earnings would have only risen so consistently, as we see here over the long term, if the profits per share were also rising quickly at the time. So here during the Gilded Age, quite a large increase. Now you might notice that the Gilded Age, often defined as roughly from 1870 to 1900, is flanked on either side by periods of even more vigorous growth in stock returns. You got the years around the Civil War here, and then the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s. In fact, during the so-called Gilded Age here in between, many people felt like the economy was stuck in a long depression, which is what they called it at the time, and which was worsened by sharp banking panics in 1873 and 1893. So not all was rosy for businesses during the Gilded Age. But America still seemed like a safer bet for investment in new state-of-the-art factories than somewhere like France in Europe, where socialist workers launched large-scale revolutions in 1848 and in 1871, threatening to seize the investments of the wealthy in France. But America's government made sure to nip these sorts of threats in the bud before they could blossom into even bigger problems. For example, when a massive nationwide strike of railroad workers in 1877 started to bring entire cities like St. Louis, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh to a standstill, the federal government sent thousands of federal troops to aid local and state militias in restoring business as usual and breaking the strikes. The federal government similarly used federal troops to break the nationwide Pullman Railroad strike in 1894, a strike that involved over 250,000 workers. Perhaps for these reasons, the U.S. continually benefited from inflows of investment money from Europe during the Gilded Age, despite the fact that wages were roughly double what they were in countries like France. If you go back and look at this chart, you'll notice, yes, wages weren't really increasing very quickly in the United States at the time, but they were already almost double what they were in Great Britain, about double what they were in France, probably triple or quadruple what they were in Belgium. So it's not that American workers had the worst standard of living in the world, but they felt like there could have been so much more potential, or that their expectations of how they ought to have been living with this new wealth and automation and whatnot. They felt like they were getting a very small sliver of this much larger pie. So why did investments in the U.S. remain profitable despite these relatively high wage costs? Reason number 2 would be state-of-the-art technological innovations that reduce the labor required to produce things in the U.S. Newer technological innovations meant better productivity and fewer hours of labor needed for the same output. So what if American wages were twice those in France? If an American worker, aided by state-of-the-art machinery, could produce more than twice the output of a French worker per every hour. To give just 2 examples of America's leading position in technological innovation, first consider the production of steel, which was pioneered by Henry Bessemer and William Kelly in England. These men came up with a new method of changing the composition of iron to steel, by blowing air through the molten iron, many of the impurities which weakened iron are removed. Steel is much more durable and versatile. Abram Hewitt, an American, learned the process in England and brought it back to the US. He introduced a new innovation, the open hearth, which allowed for larger pieces to be cast, such as large steel beams for skyscrapers or long rails for railroads. New giant furnaces were built in Pittsburgh that could produce 500 tons of steel per week. And for this reason, we see steel production and costs in the US had big changes during the Gilded Age. The production of raw steel went from maybe as little as 100,000 tons per year to over 10 million tons per year. So, 100 times the amount of steel production. And then the cost per ton of steel dropping from about $110 per ton to about $30 per ton. Another huge advance during this period was with the oil industry, with petroleum. Oil was first used as fuel for street and house lamps and as a lubricant for machinery. John D. Rockefeller got his head start in the oil business by employing engineers who figured out how to take the mixture of substances present in oil and separate out each individual ingredient, such as tar, paraffin wax, gasoline, etc. These products of oil refining turned out to have all sorts of uses and became hot commodities. Now notice that John D. Rockefeller got all of the credit and got almost all of the profits, became a billionaire, despite the fact that it was mostly his engineers whom he employed, who were the real entrepreneurs in a sense. That's a common theme in the Gilded Age, something that people felt like was unjust. Another reason for American economic growth was that raw materials were cheap. Not only, particularly cheap in the US, that is. Not only did the United States have millions of acres of untapped lands out west, but the US also had good infrastructure to allow companies to access those lands. Telegraph and telephone lines, harbors, and railroads. The US also had low taxes on businesses. Before the passage of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution in 1913, it was unconstitutional for the federal government to impose income taxes on individuals or corporations. Instead, the federal government mainly relied on historically high rates of taxes on imports, or tariffs as they're known, in order to raise revenue during the Gilded Age. But the amount of revenue raised in this way, relative to the country's overall output, was very small in the Gilded Age compared to the revenue that the federal government collects nowadays. Investors in the Gilded Age lost very little of their profits to taxes, and investors liked this. And then the fifth reason for economic growth, and why business thrived so well in the Gilded Age, had to do with favorable Supreme Court rulings that favored business. Time and time again during the Gilded Age, the Supreme Court prohibited the federal government from regulating or meddling in the activities of businesses. For example, in Wabash versus Illinois in 1886, the Supreme Court ruled that states could not pass laws regulating railroad companies because this would interfere with interstate commerce, which is supposed to be a matter for the federal government's concern, according to the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. On the other hand, in United States versus E.C. Knight Company in 1895, the Supreme Court concluded that the heavily monopolized sugar industry in the U.S. did not have anything to do with interstate commerce, and thus had no right to be subject to the anti-monopoly regulations of the federal government's Interstate Commerce Commission and the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1891, which was passed into law precisely in order to empower the federal government to break up these sorts of monopolies. It seemed to many Americans at the time that the Supreme Court was inconsistent and selective about interpreting concepts like interstate commerce in whichever way it would most benefit businesses in each case. Reformers felt frustrated, but investors could rest assured that pesky legislators would not be able to interfere in their businesses' profit making. And possible reason number 6 for the economic growth in the Gilded Age was the immigration and the closing of the Western frontier. Wages are always influenced by the tug of war between the number of positions that businesses would like to fill and the number of workers competing for those positions. One might be tempted to assume that the presence of more workers competing for a given number of jobs would cause wages to fall and would make businesses very happy to be able to pay lower wages. According to this logic, the drying up of free land on the western frontier would have both served to keep wages low by increasing the number of desperate workers in America looking for a job. Likewise, the vast wave of immigration that the U.S. experienced in the late 1800s and early 1900s would have also helped to keep wages low by increasing job applicants, assuming that the number of job openings remained constant. And here's a graph showing immigration from some of the main countries that were where immigrants were coming from to the U.S. There's a big spike here in around the turn of the century in the late Gilded Age. Also, more recent spike of Mexican immigrants, although this has actually declined quite a bit in recent years. The years of the most rapid Mexican immigration were actually in the late 90s and early 2000s. The U.S. had a much smaller population during the Gilded Age, so consequently the immigration waves during the Gilded Age had a much larger impact, despite having been smaller than recent immigration waves in absolute numbers. In absolute numbers, these recent waves of immigration have been very large, but relative to the population, if you look at the percent of foreign-born residents in the U.S., it peaked actually around 15% in the Gilded Age, and it's, as of 2010, less than 13%. However, so that's what immigration looked like in the Gilded Age. Then there's still the question of what kind of consequences did this immigration have, particularly on wages. Because a lot of working people in the Gilded Age were concerned that immigration was driving their wages down. The problem with that, why this is confusing, is because in theory, one cannot be certain that the number of jobs on offer from employers will always remain at a given constant level while the population of the country is changing. An influx of more workers into the country might increase the number of positions employers would like to fill. This could happen because more workers in the country means more consumers in the country, and more consumers means more sales of consumer goods and more reason for companies to hire more workers to increase output. So in theory, the number of jobs offered could increase even faster than the number of willing workers coming into the country. This could mean that an influx of immigrants could actually raise wages by causing job openings to rise faster than job applicants. On the other hand, a person can buy American-made products whether that person lives in Mexico or the U.S. So are sales of American products really going to increase just because some people move from, for example, Mexico to the U.S.? They could already buy American products in Mexico. So even if they're buying American products now in the U.S., there might not be any difference in sales. Consequently, are the job openings at American companies really going to increase from a population influx into the U.S.? Before they were buying American-made goods in Mexico, now they're going to buy American-made goods in the U.S. What's the difference? Perhaps for certain kinds of services that must be performed on-site and which cannot be exported to consumers abroad. In that case, you probably would see more business, more sales being done, more people here in the country. In that case, a larger population in the U.S. does mean more demand for those services. But this increase in service job openings, is it enough to outweigh the increase in job seekers, because now you also have more job seekers in the country. One might also ask, does a person's move from, for example, Mexico to your town in the United States, does that really increase the competition for your job? It wouldn't if that person is already competing for your job. For example, if your employer can move your job to Mexico, then you are already competing with people in Mexico for your job, whether those people stay in Mexico or whether they move to the US. Either they can move to where your job is or your job can move to them. Either way, you're already in competition with Mexican workers, Chinese workers. There's no way to escape that competition. Keeping immigrants out of the country isn't going to save you from that competition, in a way. One might also ask, do we need to accept it as a given, as an inevitable fact of life, that there will always be more job seekers than job openings at a certain wage level? Is there no way for us as citizens to control what jobs are offered and how many and at which wage levels? Now, these are complicated questions with many differing points of view, which is why I am hesitant to offer any simplistic theory about how the high levels of immigration during the Gilded Age kept wages low and profits for businesses high. That's a standard story that you often hear, but I'm not so sure about it. However, regardless of what I think the truth was, it is undeniable that many Americans during the Gilded Age perceived immigration as a threat to their wages. The trade unions in the American Federation of Labor consistently tried to keep immigrants, blacks, and women out of their trades so as to limit the potential job seekers in their fields. And the Omaha platform of the Populist Party in 1892 called for stricter limits to immigration. In their words, they said, "Resolved, that we condemn the fallacy of protecting American labor under the present system, which opens our ports to the pauper and criminal classes of the world and crowds out our wage earners, and we denounce the present ineffective laws against contract labor and demand the further restriction of undesirable immigration." So let me pause it here, and I'll pick up in the second half of this lesson with how did Americans react to this new wealth and its vastly unequal accumulation. More on that in part 2.